Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will be making an amendment with this particular speech. Honourable Senators, assisted suicide is final. There is absolutely no room for error, or innocent lives will be lost. That is why any consideration of expanding the regime to those for whom death is not reasonably foreseeable must be subject to the most stringent safeguards. The courts have also said this. And yet, in Bill C-7, the federal government has started to roll back even the safeguards that were put into the legislation less than 5 years ago. Bill C-7 would eliminate the 10-day waiting period between a request for and the delivery of assisted dying where death is reasonably foreseeable. It allows for the waiver of final consent, opening the door to advance directives. And it removes the requirement that a request for assisted death must be signed before 2 independent witnesses. Now, only one will do. We are treading on dangerous and shifting ground here, and it is moving too fast. It was only 5 years ago, during our pre-study on the issue of assisted dying, that our legal committee voted unanimously to ensure at least 15 clear days between signing a request for MAID and providing the death. We sent that recommendation back to the Trudeau government, but they refused to accept it, instead opting for 10 days. Even at that, it could be shortened if necessary in order to preserve consent. Now here we are, and they're removing it altogether. Even the creator of the original assisted dying legislation, former Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould, has expressed concern about the removal of safeguards in Bill C-7. Last fall, in question period, she asked the current Justice Minister, David Lametti, why this new legislation abandons safeguards from Bill C-14, especially when neither the lower Quebec Court's Truchon decision nor the Supreme Court's Carter decision required it. The minister's response? To refer to his so-called intensive consultations the government supposedly conducted on this bill. Are those the same intensive consultations one Indigenous witness at committee called inadequate, and of which another said, quote, "I don't believe there has been any engagement in a proper way," quote. Or perhaps it was what disability rights group Inclusion Canada has called the hasty and completely inadequate process for roundtable discussions with persons with disabilities. Or maybe Minister Lametti was referring to the government's online consultation, which I can assure you was minimal because I filled it out myself. The questions were written in a prescribed way with only limited answers to steer responses in one direction, and the only way to provide additional information was in long-form comments that are more difficult to quantify. Media reported that some people had taken the online questionnaire multiple times, some even dozens of times. It's ridiculous. Canadians didn't get adequate consultations. We didn't have a parliamentary review. All this Trudeau government has given us on this is SurveyMonkey. That's not consultation, honourable senators, and it is not a sufficient basis for rolling back protections that are meant to safeguard people's lives. There is no return policy with assisted suicide. Dr. Harvey Schipper warned the legal committee about the need to retain safeguards in Bill C-7 because of the lack of any evidence to the contrary. He said, quote, "I don't think we have the evidence to remove any safeguards. In fairness, I don't think we have the evidence to add new ones. We just don't know. You have got trivial data from 13,000 cases of MAID in Canada. Certainly taking out the waiting period is really, really foolish. It's unbiological," quote. The courts have understood the necessity for strong safeguards in the establishment of any assisted dying regime. In its Carter decision, the Supreme Court of Canada agreed with the trial judge that the risks associated with physician-assisted death can be limited through a carefully designed and monitored system of safeguards. The lower Quebec Court decision in Truchon stated, quote, "The court instead accepts that the other eligibility criteria and safeguards already in place in the legislation are sufficient to ensure that the system can provide medical assistance in dying to individuals who are entitled to it," quote. Neither court ruling called for the revocation of existing safeguards. The Trudeau government asserts that removing the 10-day waiting period between the day the request for MAID is signed and the day it occurs causes increased suffering. Of course, this does not take into account the risk of shortening a life prematurely in the event that a patient might change his or her mind. Law professor Trudeau Lemons spoke to this balance at our legal committee, quote, "The argument for removal of the reflection period is that it cruelly imposes suffering on people who have made up their mind already, but that ignores that it protects people who may have weeks, months, or even years of further meaningful life. There is, to my knowledge, no ethical, legal, or medical expertise that permits us to confidently conclude that the suffering of some associated with the delay outweighs the risk that others are prematurely deprived of their life. Nothing can undo a person's death. It seems perfectly reasonable in public policy to err on the side of prudence, quote. Proponents of assisted suicide maintain that people who wish to access assisted dying have already made up their minds by the time they are within 10 days of completing MAID. We heard significant testimony at our legal committee pre-study that suicidality can fluctuate greatly. Dr. Harvey Chuchnov testified, quote, "Our research group reported that will to live can fluctuate highly over intervals as short as 12 to 24 hours. In fact, 40% of patients who were prescribed lethal drugs in Oregon decided not to take a lethal overdose, preferring to let their underlying disease take its natural course," quote. Dr. Leonie Hertz from the Canadian Society of Palliative Care Physicians expressed her concern about the removal of the 10-day waiting period, saying, quote, "If you remove the 10-day waiting period, we will be in a situation in Canada where people can request MAID and get it on the same day, when we've just heard that up to 40% of people have not even had palliative care involvement prior to requesting MAID. And now, with this legislation, we're possibly going to be ending someone's life on the same day when they've not had proper information or proper experience of how their suffering could be addressed in other ways." Quote, "Clearly, a decision of this magnitude requires additional reflection. Honourable Senators, this period of reflection is only 10 days. That's shorter than a long-range weather forecast or a COVID self-quarantine period. You get more time than that to return a small purchase from most stores. Senators, we in the Senate of Canada are a body of sober second thought. Shouldn't Canadians have the ability for sober second thought about ending their own lives? The government seems to be throwing out safeguards without even understanding what it is they're doing. Take, for example, the provision in Bill C-7, which will reduce the required number of independent witnesses for a request for MAID from 2 down to 1. When Minister Patty Hajdu appeared before our legal committee, she told us, quote, "The only role of a witness is to confirm the identity of the person signing and dating their requests. Witnesses play no role in determining whether someone is eligible for MAID or whether their decision is voluntary and informed," quote. The minister said this during her pre-planned and prepared opening remarks, so this comment obviously was not off the cuff. Yet when I asked Department of Justice officials to verify that last week, they told me, quote, "Our view would be that the role of the witness to the written request is both to confirm that the person signing the request is the person the request is about, and to confirm that the person understands what it is they are signing and is signing it voluntarily," quote. It seems that the Trudeau government is in such a rush to push this legislation through that their ministers are failing to read the fine print. Does Minister Hajdu even know what's going on? We know she doesn't know what's going on with vaccine contracts, but she doesn't even know the process for people to die, the process she is helping to expand. There is no excuse for that kind of negligence by a minister in life or death matters as important as these. It is this Trudeau government's haste to make these changes so quickly, too quickly, that concerns me the most. During a pandemic where people are suffering and everything else seems to be delayed or moving slowly, this government can't seem to get this assisted suicide legislation passed fast enough. It is ready to abandon whatever safeguards it can, like a boat taking on water. Why this bill? Why now? We haven't even had a parliamentary review. We don't even know yet what we don't know. And the courts haven't asked the government to roll back significant safeguards. That is why I am proposing an amendment today that will restore the 10-day reflection period and the requirement for 2 witnesses to the way those safeguards were originally instituted under Bill C-14. Honourable Senators, one of our primary responsibilities as Senators is to protect the vulnerable and represent their views in this chamber. We need to look out for those vulnerable people now. Let us retain those crucial safeguards to at least try to ensure that Canadians are properly protected under this legislation. Therefore, in amendment, I move that Bill C-7 be not now read a third time, but that it be amended in Clause 1A on page 3 by deleting lines 19 to 34, B on page 4 by replacing line 19 with the following, quote, "Shun, sub 4, before two independent witnesses who then, I'll quote, "Honourable Senators, I ask for your support. Thank you."
Senator Batters, we have Senator Deakin, Ontario, with a question. Senator Deakin, Ontario.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Okay. I do thank you, Senator Batters. I certainly understand your passion and leadership in this area. And I think I understand the integrity of the concern around making sure that we're as diligent as possible with safeguards and certainly due process. So my question tonight is around the 10-day waiting period, if you don't mind. I've certainly read that many feel this 10-day waiting period is cruel and unnecessary, given that it extends patients' suffering, and in some cases, they will even stop taking medication to ensure they're of sound mind when the day comes to accept medical assistance in dying. So I'm wondering, through the work that you've done, if there are any numbers on the people that have used this 10-day period to change their mind. And what I'm trying to get at tonight is I'm wondering if the risks of, with respect to everybody, if the risks of extending suffering for patients outweighs the risks that some will change their mind in this 10-day period. Thank you.
Senator Batters.
Thank you for that question, Senator Deakin. First of all, it's important to note that there already is the provision in that particular 10-day waiting period subsection, and this would be retained with my amendment, that if there is any possibility of capacity or the ability to have informed consent lost during that time frame, they can already reduce that all the way down to 0. So that provision is already there and would remain under this particular amendment that I've proposed here. As far as the number of people that were being asked or potentially have already received MAID in Canada or have requested it, we just have received so little data from the government. I mean, number one, there's a problem, as we've heard throughout our legal studies. There's a problem in the type of data. There's just minimal data that's really available to us to know very much about it. So what we've found so far, and there's a desire to have increased data so we know more about these types of cases. But so a lot of times, as I did in my speech, I quoted from Oregon and witnesses who have seen the more international experience, and certainly that it has happened over a longer period of time. But that's something that I know others are trying to encourage the federal government to do, to have better data collection so that we can know more about these types of cases. But the ability to waive that period, that's already in there. It would be retained. And as far as for some, there might be a slightly longer, like a few days period of suffering. However, I think that the risk of somebody being put to death and potentially changing their mind if they had that reflection period, as opposed to, it's already quite a short period of time. As I said, we previously were going to have a longer period of time. There were some of us that wanted to have a much longer period of time, but it is only 10 days. It's quite a short period of time, and that's why I think that this is a reasonable safeguard. It was something that Jody Wilson-Raybould very much agreed that it was a reasonable safeguard, as did Health Minister Jane Philpott at the time. They thought that was crucial to have those safeguards in place and make sure that the most vulnerable people are protected, because that's really what we have to do. Is we can't just look at, we have to look at that small, maybe small, certain number of people who might be affected in the worst possible dire consequences, that they may be put to death and instead might have changed their mind.